Kyrie Sebastos, huios, theos, theo ek theou. If my Greek is correct, that means hail the emperor, son of a god and god from God. That is the type of thing you could read or see in an inscription or read in a text somewhere in the Roman Empire in the first century, that the Roman emperor was not just a leader, an epic, unrivaled figure of honor, power, and supremacy, but was in fact regarded as something of a god. And in fact, the worship of the Roman emperor, the veneration of the Roman emperor as a divine being, was one of the most significant religious aspects of Mediterranean religion in the first century. And this is very significant for early Christianity as well. And you could argue that there's something of a confrontation in the New Testament between the son of David, Jesus, and the son of Caesar, or the son of the divine Augustus, over who was the true ruler of the world. That's why I want to talk about in this text and traditions episode about the Roman imperial cult and its relevance for the study of the New Testament. Okay, first of all, let me say something about ancient ruler cults. These were very common in the ancient Near East, in places like Egypt, Mesopotamia, Babylon. Now, they're very diverse in their expression and form. The ruler could be worshipped as a god, or in the very least, a son of the god, maybe even a descendant of the god, or a representation of them, an embodiment of them. And that's why their image could be put in the temple of a deity, in art or in statues or in visual representations. They could be portrayed in the guise of one of the local deities. So the king was something of a servant of the gods, maybe even a descendant and a manifestation of them. Now, this even affects Israelite religion, in certain ways as well. I think it's the end of First Chronicles, where Solomon is regarded as having the throne of Yahweh, sitting on the throne of Yahweh, sharing the throne with Yahweh. Or think of Psalm 2, where you've got this sort of a scene which seems to be a mixture between an accession of the king and an adoption, coming into regal power. But this is the point where they become more formally a son of Yahweh, and they're going to rule, and the local client kingdoms are going to submit to the king. That kind of thing. This is using the same divine rhetoric for monarchs that you find in the ancient Near East. Or there's Psalm 45 as well, which is a wedding psalm, which refers to the Israelite king as your throne, O God, will live forever. That type of language as well. In addition to that, you can go to Isaiah 9, where the future Davidic king is going to be called literally mighty God, I think in Hebrew, El Gabor, or in the Greek translation, the Septuagint, he's called angel of the great council. And in later Messianism, you can find Jewish rulers being described with supernatural and regal language brought together. So the Son of Man figure, or the one like a Son of Man in Daniel 7, seems to be a representative of Yahweh's kingdom, Yahweh's rule, and Yahweh's people, and at the same time is almost like a heavenly angelic figure. Okay, so kings can be described with sort of divine-like qualities. The other thing we find in the Jewish world is that the veneration of the king, which is kind of similar to the ancient Near East, is not strictly the same, though, because people are not offering sacrifices to the king, okay? The king is not putting his own image in the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem. So although the Israelite religion has a certain rhetoric, a certain description of the king that resonates with ancient Near Eastern ruler worship, it's not quite the same, because there are a few restraints, there are a few scruples in ancient Israelite religion that meant that was not possible. Now, with Alexander the Great conquering the East in the 4th century, that was a real game changer, because as he moved eastward, he began to receive from his own subjects type of ruler worship and forms of divine veneration. Now, Alexander himself may have been trying to perpetuate the idea that he actually was the son of Zeus, that Zeus had, impregnated his mother. So it's a little bit of a debate whether he was pushing that or other people were using it to up his reputation. By the time he goes down to Egypt, however, when he meets with the priests of Ammon, that is where either he is convinced or they convince him that he is a divine being, because only a divine being or someone of divine power can really conquer the world or the known world the way that Alexander has. And as he keeps going east, through Persia, into Bactria, on the doorstep of India, then at his court, he seems to request formally divine honors, and in particular, the custom of proskunesis, which is prostration or obedience or bowing down to someone. Now, this was controversial because this was regarded as a very servile thing to do. It was like a barbarian custom. That's what the Persian kings do, not us, Macedonians, because the Macedonian kings, they ruled largely with the consent of the aristocracy. It was kind of like that, a little bit more egalitarian. So to offer divine honors to a Macedonian king was considered something a little bit affronting. And it was certainly controversial at the time and in the Macedonian court. Nonetheless, it did happen. And after Alexander's death, regardless of how much he was pushing it or not, he definitely received divine honors. And there was a very big cult to Alexander that had its headquarters in Alexandria, where his body was. In the various kingdoms that were appearing in the aftermath of Alexander the Great's death, particularly the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria, Babylon, and Persia, you also get a fair bit of ruler worship for them. Now, it starts off a little bit subdued. Certain kings like the Ptolemies could be called saviors and benefactors when they help out a certain city being invaded from the other side. And the Seleucids as well gradually began to offer divine honors to their various monarchs as well. But it was different. The Ptolemies, they're largely taking the Egyptian religion, which already had a place for the divine worship, and then fusing it with these Hellenistic traditions. And the cult of Alexander was a great precursor to that. With the Seleucids, they've got a far more diverse population. They've got various ethnic groups and religious identities that are floating around. Eventually, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, he's going to try unify them with this sort of imposition of Greek culture, and he's going to do it rather brutally and shall we say, with to ill effect to the Judeans when he tries to put a copy of a statue of Zeus in the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple and try to ban the Jewish religion, to which the Jews, it turns out, were rather resistant to. But ruler worship was a big thing in the ancient Near East. As the Romans themselves began to roll through the East, you get the same thing going on. They gradually encounter this phenomena of ruler worship as subjects want to start offering divine worship to their conquerors, to the emperor, and also even some of the proconsuls who are set up as leaders in parts of Asia or on some islands. Even they start to receive divine honors. Now, this is something of a dilemma or a problem for the Romans, because not only did they not worship their own rulers, they didn't even have a king. They were meant to have a republic. They were meant to have two consuls. Not one person who is the epitome of all power and is considered a god. In fact, that idea was an anathema to the Romans. It was good to have people who were successful and powerful, but you do not want too much power and glory invested in one person. They'd been through that path before, and it never ended particularly well. But there were precedents for it. You've got the story of the deification of Romulus, who was one of the first kings, and he was in fact considered the mythological founder of Rome. He becomes a god, and I think he's even identified with the god Quirinius, who Julius Caesar would also be identified with much later as well. There's also the cult of the dead, those kind of things. And for some of the leaders, like the Gracchi brothers, who brought in some really good reforms for the plebs. I mean, they could be offered some tacitly divine offers, people pouring libations for them at festivals, that type of thing. But generally, the Romans did not have the sort of divine worship that they had in the ancient Near East and then the Hellenistic East. But as they pushed eastward, some of their officials, some of their leaders did begin to be given divine honors. And it becomes easier to understand once some of the Romans are achieving, big ticket things, okay? So think of someone like Pompey, Pompey the Great, Roman statesman and general. He defeats some of the Marian rebels during the dictatorship of Sulla. He also puts down the slave rebellion of Spartacus. He also eliminates the problem of piracy in the Eastern Mediterranean. And then he goes on trying to do war with Mithridates and goes as far as Armenia, kind of formally annexes Syria, brings Judea into the Roman Empire as well. So he's got some big accomplishments. And so he starts to receive honors in Italy that we could consider divine. And you see someone like Cicero kind of wrestling with this topic. What do we do about this? Should we accept this idea of generals, our own consuls receiving divine honors? And he's a little bit ambivalent about it. And the view that Cicero seems to come down to is, okay, look, divine honors are really good once you die. And in fact, it may well be a really good incentive to be a capable, wise, and good ruler, because if you're good enough, then when you die, we'll deify you. Okay, but we don't want to do that just yet. I mean, that would be getting a bit ahead of ourselves. You might get a bit of a big head if we do it now. The problem is, though, with Julius Caesar, who defeated Pompey and the other forces of the Republic, and he established a dictatorship. I mean, he'd conquered the Gauls. He then conquered Egypt and formally, he brought it into the empire and into a certain degree. And he was planning to go east and take on the Parthians. But he achieved so many victories that he was considered the unconquered god. Okay, and they put a statue of him or an image of him in a temple, I think, of Quirinus, if I'm remembering that correctly. So, so there was a precedent for the worship of a living figure as a divine being. With Julius Caesar's assassination, it is his heir or his successor, Octavian, who then becomes known as Augustus, the Venerable One. He basically sponsors the idea that upon death, Julius Caesar was deified. He became a god. He became a divus. He became the divine Julius. Okay, and people say, well, I saw a comet in the sky, and Octavian puts coins on that with him and Julius Caesar holding hands, type of thing, with a comet in the sky. With Augustus's eventual supremacy, when he defeats the Republican forces and then he takes on Mark Antony, then you do have this rush for all the various client kings in the East. You have this big rush to get in on venerating and worshipping the Roman emperor. Now, this was particularly an issue for Herod. You see, in the civil war between Augustus and Mark Antony and Cleopatra, Herod the Great was on the side of Antony and Cleopatra. The problem is they lost. And the old saying, it's only treason if you lose. And well, Herod lost. So he then quickly has to ingratiate himself to Augustus. And one of the ways he does that is by building a number of temples to Augustus, a temple for the worship of the Roman emperor. Builds this massive one in Caesarea Maritima, another one, I think possibly Caesarea Philippi, or that one's a little bit more controversial how it relates to the local deity. Certainly in Samaria, in fact, he renames the city Sebast, after Sebastos for the Venerable One. He builds a huge temple in Samaria, bang smack of the heart of Israel. Now, Herod had to do one of two things. He had to kind of prove his loyalty to the Roman Empire, to the emperor, give the divine worship that everyone else was giving the Roman emperor. But the problem he also had is he was Jewish, and Jews are not supposed to worship anyone beside God, certainly not worshiping images of anything like images of an emperor. So Herod basically established these two independent religions, trying to keep them siloed and far apart. He basically ringed Judea with imperial temples to the emperor, where there would be sacrifices and images and celebrations of the emperor, in this case, Augustus. But he also wanted to maintain the integrity of the Judean cultus, that they were not going to put a image of Augustus in the temple. They were not going to build a temple to Augustus next to the temple of Yahweh. So he wanted this sort of two independent type of worships, which was his way of working within the system. The other thing the Jews did is that they would not offer sacrifices to the emperor, but they would offer sacrifices for the emperor. And the idea of sacrificing for the emperor is a very common sort of thing that people did back then. They didn't just sacrifice to, they sacrificed for the emperor, for the emperor's health and victory, success, well-being, and that kind of a thing. We could say a few more things here about the imperial cult. The first thing you've got to know is that it actually is a real religion. It's not just flattery and vanity. Yes, it's got an obvious political dimension, but they're offering real worship. I mean, that they regard that the Roman emperor is a kind of real God, real within the symbolic universe of Roman power, religion, and its understanding of the world and the universe. Okay, the Roman emperor seems to have this preeminent, this pinnacle and summit of power and authority, that the only analogy for it has to be a divine being. And because the Roman emperor offers such great benefactions and benefits, bringing peace from civil war, saving them from foreign invasion from the tribes across the Rhine or the Danube or beyond the Euphrates, that the only fitting response is a kind of divine worship. And they'll offer all sorts of worship. I mean, you could just build a temple and just leave it there. You could build a temple and have a priesthood, build a temple with a priesthood with sacrifices. You could bring out images of the emperor at festivals. I mean, there was a number of things, which is why the imperial cults were incredibly diverse, okay? For example, like, the Judeans, I mean, they didn't have a temple to Augustus in Jerusalem, but they did sacrifices to the emperor. Some cities were even very eager, okay, to be the ones who initiated this. So places like Pergamum, they want a temple and a cult for the emperor, and the emperor says, okay, fine, but only for the Roman citizens who were there, so they can worship the goddess Roma. Tiberius eventually gets one in Smyrna. Caligula, initiates this massive one on the island of Miletus, which is very important, and it's embedded with the local gods as well. So it's not just the emperor cult as a new religion; it's embedded with the local religion. So you could have a statue of Augustus in the temple to Diana or to Artemis. Or, I mean, that they would try to link in with the local religion. So there's a strong association being built between the princeps, between the polis, the city, and the local pantheon. These things are all being merged together so that Roman power, okay, and divine power and the divine gods are all there. So it wasn't just imposed. It could be in some places, particularly in troublesome provinces like Gaul or parts of Spain. But generally, it's something that local elites sought after because it gave them great prestige. Because if you could be someone who builds a temple to the emperor, how good is that for you? And particularly if you and your friends become the main priests in that temple, and then local associations, local people, they all wanted in on that. It was a way of ingratiating themselves to the hierarchy of imperial power and prestige, and it's something anyone could get. It was a type of currency that was available to pretty much anyone. Now, what does all of this have to do with early Christianity? Well, it's got a number of things. First of all, you could say there is a type of hostility, just as the Jews could be hostile to emperor worship. You find that like in Isaiah 14 about the king of Tyre, or the description about Nebuchadnezzar, who wants people to bow down to a statue of him. Christians, it seemed, shared that same innate hostility towards ruler worship. But here's the funny thing. They seem to parody it. They seem to imitate it in their own way in the type of devotion that they gave to Christ. I mean, something like Psalm 110, in its original context, depicts, Yahweh saying to the Israelite king, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And that is a kind of a manifestation of ancient ruler cults, being a throne sharer with the deity. I mean, that's very big. And that becomes one of the defining ways that early Christians thought about the divinity of Jesus, being a throne sharer with Yahweh. Now, again, what's happening in Psalm 110, I think, is a little bit different to what you might find, say, in ancient Egypt or in ancient Persia. But the idea of being a throne sharer with a god was a very common thing. And that was one of the main ways in which they talked about the divinity, the authority, and the person of Jesus in terms of his divine being and divine status. So this was the kind of the irony. They're sort of, critiquing ruler worship. I mean, you see that in Acts 12 as well, where the critique of Herod Agrippa I, who kind of accepts divine worship from the people of Tyre and Sidon. The book of Revelation itself is a massive critique of the imperial cult and the worship of the emperor. But Christians are also kind of tacitly using similar language for their own devotion to the Lord Jesus. Justin Martyr acknowledges this in the 2nd century. He says, of course, there's similarity. You people are like an evil, the emperor worship is like an evil imitation of the worship of the one true Lord of the world, which is none other than Jesus of Nazareth. Now, this leads to some big debates as well about how anti-imperial were the early Christians. Were they really against the empire? Is it a case of, as Tom Wright says, if Jesus is Lord, then Caesar is not? I've written a little bit about this in my book, An Anomalous Jew, about Paul and the Roman Empire. On the one hand, if you read Romans 13, it looks pretty innocuous, like he wants Christians just to keep their head down, stay there below the parapet, be the grey man, don't kick up a fuss, don't kick the hornet's nest. In other words, give respect, give honor. But if you get to Romans 15:12, Paul quotes Isaiah 11:10, where he talks about how the root of Jesse will rise and rule the nations. Okay. Now, if you take that statement about itself, on its own terms, that strikes me as, well, it's more than a smoking gun of the anti-imperial ethos that Paul has. Okay. It's, if I can give an analogy, it's more like the Praetorian Guard have gone into the emperor's apartment, found Paul standing over the dead emperor with a big pool of blood on the ground, Paul holding a knife saying, I'm glad I killed the so-and-so, something like that. I mean, that verse, Romans 15:12, I think gives the game away, that Paul and the early Christians did look forward to a day where God in Christ would subdue all powers, the various pantheons, and even the princeps, the first citizen, the first person of the Roman Empire. They didn't believe it was their job to bring that about now in a kind of violent coup, because you'd probably end up just replacing one dictator with another one. But they certainly did look forward to a day when Christ would be by might what he is by right, and there would be that sort of reordering of power where the first will be last and the last will be first. And the sort of counter-imperial image of Christianity does have an enduring image, certainly in the book of Revelation. You certainly get it as well, I think, in the Acts of Paul. By the time you get to someone like Tertullian in the early 3rd century, he's trying to be a little bit more delicate. He says, okay, look, we'll honor the emperor, got no problems with giving the emperor his due. I mean, he's a powerful guy. He's an agent of God. He's a servant of God. will give him the honor, the taxes, his due, can't call him God, and can't call him Lord if you mean Lord in like a religious sense. But hey, otherwise, totally keen on the emperor. We pray for him. In fact, we pray for him so much. He's more our emperor than he is your emperor. Okay, so that's something of the imperial cult and its relationship to the early church. Some things I can recommend that you read. If you want to see what happens with the imperial cult and Judaism, you've definitely got to read Philo's embassy to Gaius, because one big event there, as you might know, Caligula wanted to put a statue of himself in the Jerusalem temple. Now, a number of things seem to have driven him to do that. There were some riots going on in Alexandria, where the local Greeks and Romans were ragging on the Jews because they would not worship the emperor. And so this big riot, they would put statues of Caligula in some of the synagogues, stuff like that they were doing. And then on the coast in Israel, in Gemnia, in the town there, some local hotheads tried to put, or they did put, a statue of Caligula in one of the synagogues, and then some of the local Jews tore it all down. These episodes seem to have really cheesed off Caligula, who took his divine honors pretty seriously. And he was wanting to put his own statue in the temple, and that episode and all about it you can read about here. And he offers a really good Jewish critique of emperor worship, which is kind of this is the paradox. He offers this sort of incredible critique of Caligula's pretensions to divinity. He prances around, thinks he's Jupiter and that type of thing, and yet Philo can also say the various cities of the world considered Augustus, worthy of divine honors equal to the gods. He seems to have no problem with pagan cities worshipping Augustus as a god, but he drops from some serious rhetoric about Caligula and his pretensions to a divine status. You can also read Mark Reasoner's book, Roman Imperial Text. This is good. It gives you a whole bunch of primary sources, mainly literary, that is very useful. Another book I really love and recommend is Joseph Fanton, Lord of the Entire World. This is a great book, particularly, it's almost like a really sophisticated word study on the word kurios in light of the Roman imperial cult. Another one I'll give you as well is Harry O'Meara, Picturing Paul and the Empire. This is good because whereas a lot of people rely on literary sources to talk about the imperial cult and the emperor, O'Meara kind of gives you a lot more about the visual representations of power. And I mean, seriously, think about, walking through a town, and in every house, every bar, pub, brothel, there's images of the emperor, everywhere, and people offering sacrifices to his genius or his numen in their own house, that type of thing. Another one I can mention as well is Bruce Winter's Divine Honors for the Caesars. So you can find some good things about the imperial cult there. In terms of the imperial cult and Christology, probably the number one person to read on that is Adela Collins. She's the one who's argued that places like Philippians 2, you've got some really close connections, like being equal with God is the same as iso theoi timai, or honors equal to the gods. So Adela Collins is very good on that. If you know a little bit of German, you could read Monica Bennett and her study of Herod and the imperial cult, but that's obviously for more advanced readers. So yeah, that's a little bit about the imperial cult and its relevance to the study of early Christianity.